The Holy Gospel according to St. Mark, the 9th chapter.
Glory to you, O Lord.
Jesus and the disciples passed through Galilee. He did not want anyone to know it, for he was teaching his disciples, saying to them, "The Son of Man is to be betrayed into human hands, and they will kill him. And after 3 days after being killed, he will rise again." But they did not understand what he was saying, and were afraid to ask him. Then they came to Capernaum, and when he was in the house, he asked them, "What were you arguing about on the way?" But they were silent, for they had argued with one another about who was the greatest. He sat down, called the 12, and said to them, "Whoever wants to be first must be last of all and servant of all." Then he took a little child and put it among them, and taking it in his arms, he said to them, "Whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me. And whoever welcomes me welcomes not me, but the one who sent me." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
Several years back, there was a popular saying that I still see every once in a while on the back of a car or somewhere else. And it's 4 letters, WWJD. Maybe you've seen that before. Maybe you have that on the back of your car. It was the initials to a question that was first asked in a book called In His Steps by a man by the name of Charles Sheldon. What would Jesus do? Is the question. The story of the novel is basically this. The pastor of a congregation, Henry Maxwell, challenges the people that he serves to ask this one question: what would Jesus do for an entire year? Then throughout the novel, Pastor Maxwell's congregation struggles with that very question in their everyday lives. I remember thinking about that same question one Monday morning in a classroom at Lutheran Theological Southern Seminary. There I was, my first year of seminary, fresh out of college, excited and filled with all sorts of energy about the fact that I was now in seminary. And there we were with all of our classmates in the Introduction to Pastoral Care class. And that very question came up as our devotion for that morning. Our professor started out by writing 4 letters on the chalkboard, WWJD. And then he began to tell us just what Jesus would do. To start the conversation, he wrote 4 other letters underneath WWJD. GSDR. Go, suffer, die, rise. And over the next few minutes, he said, here's what Jesus would do. He would go to Jerusalem, suffer at the hands of the religious and political authorities, die an unjust death on the cross, and then on the 3rd day be raised from the dead. Go, suffer, die, rise. Not exactly the happiest of thoughts to think on a Monday morning at 8 o'clock, but true nonetheless. Because in our gospel reading for this morning, Jesus tells his disciples that is exactly what will happen to him. Careful readers of Mark's gospel will notice that this is the 2nd time that Jesus has predicted that he will go, suffer, die, and then rise. This news is apparently so difficult for the disciples to get that they don't even ask Jesus the first question about what he has now said to them twice. See, I think it's funny sometimes when people talk about wanting to feel good and uplifted when they come out of church. Now, there are times when that happens. I think about that feeling that I had when I left church last Sunday after a glorious and wonderful installation service filled with a magnificent choir, brass that played so wonderfully, excellent preaching from Pastor Dave, a really wonderful reception, and the community there to welcome us. It was a very moving and meaningful day for me. We all want spiritual highs, but I'm convinced that that's not the only thing that Jesus promises for us. There will be spiritual highs, but there will also be hard times. See, of the 4 letters of what Jesus would do, go, suffer, die, rise, I think we want the rising part of Jesus' life. If you don't believe me, notice the difference in church attendance on Good Friday versus Easter Sunday. On Good Friday, there are lots of seats in most sanctuaries, and I've not been here at Zion, but that's my hunch that will be true here. Prove me wrong. But then, on Easter Sunday, it's packed in here. Hardly a seat to be had at all 3 services. Good Friday, though, with all that suffering and death, it's so depressing and sad. Especially on a Friday night when our wider culture is out celebrating and having a good time. The last thing we want to talk about is death. Resurrection? Sure. But not death. And yet, no matter how hard we try, brothers and sisters, we can't get to Jesus' resurrection without first talking about his suffering and his death. The disciples missed that, which is about par for the course for them in Mark's gospel. They don't get what Jesus is saying, and they're even afraid to ask what exactly he meant. Now, in the Roman Empire of Jesus' day, it was common for people to compete for power, wealth, and prestige. As the disciples argue about who is the greatest, they seem to be falling into the trap of the wider culture. But here's the thing, Jesus says. The highest amount of prestige will not be found through high social rank and status. Jesus says that true greatness comes in the life of service. To show that, Jesus takes a child, a little child, not because a child was sweet and innocent, but because in Jesus' day, a child had no rights. In Jesus' day, a child was totally dependent upon others, and no one expected to gain any sort of prestige, status, or to gain anything else by being kind to a child in any way. A child was literally a nobody in first century culture. Serving the nobodies in our culture is something that is vitally, vitally important in our mission as God's people. Now the question is, how? How do we go about serving those whom society sees as nobodies? And I have to tell you, that's tricky. From the homeless man that we see on the street, to the person that stops by the church on a Thursday night before the praise team has a practice, what does it look like to be a servant of all? The most common question that people will ask when thinking about this is, what do we do when we're approached on the street by someone asking for money? I think lots of us have probably struggled with that. And there's no easy answer to that. Some people choose to give money to someone on the street, while others won't. That's kind of where I am. And instead, I choose to give money to local organizations that help the needy in our community. And still others choose to do both. Our Christian calling, though, as being a servant of all, starts with us seeing those who are the nobodies in society as people sent to us by Christ himself. Whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me, Jesus says. So it's not just that we can show them Jesus. That is true. But it's also that when the nobodies of society come to us, it's that they show us Jesus. They have something that we cannot find anywhere else, and they have something to show us and to give to us. The poor, the marginalized, and the needy in our society show us Jesus in a way that no one else can. Jesus is present in them. See, it's a good thing for us to engage in ministry to the nobodies of society. But we don't do it just to feel good about ourselves. We do it because Jesus is there, in the people that we would least expect him to be. And that's why our church will continue to be committed to serving the least in our society. It's why we will partner with groups like Meals on Wheels, CAM, and Habitat for Humanity. It's why our church does things like Stephen Ministry, international mission trips, Be the Church, and so many other opportunities for service. We will be a church that continues to focus on others in our society, and we will pay particular attention to the needs of the least. So often, we want to seek to be significant, to be somebody important, to have a claim to fame, or to be known for something. It is a temptation in our reality TV-based society. And it is also a temptation for us to be worried about what people think about us. Am I liked? Am I important? Do I matter? And so we strut our stuff to answer that. But the gospel reminds us that we don't need to do that. To be significant is to welcome the child in our midst. To be significant is to welcome those who normally don't find a welcome, and to know that Jesus is in them. Amen.